Okay, so today we're going to practice graphing rational functions. In our last video, I gave you these equations and we found the information for them. So if you know how to find the vertical asymptotes, the horizontal asymptotes, the x and y intercepts, you can look at the other video and it will let you know. Okay, it'll walk you through it. But today what I'm going to do is use that information that we've already found to actually graph the rational function. Okay, so one thing to note is when I do this, I have a key. So whenever I draw vertical asymptotes, I use yellow. When I draw horizontal, I use green. And when I do x and y intercepts, I use blue. Okay, and then I actually use red to draw the curves themselves. Okay, so that's the first thing I'm going to do, is that I'm going to use the information I've already found and plot them on the graph before we start doing anything else. So I have a vertical at -3, 1, 2, 3. So here's my vertical asymptote at x equals -3. I have another one at x equals 2. Then I have a horizontal asymptote at y equals 1/2. That's a horizontal line right here at 1/2. Okay. Next, I'm going to plot my intercepts. So -2, which is right there, 0, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 0. Those are my x-intercepts. And my y-intercept is at 0, 2/3, which is actually above my horizontal asymptote up there, but not quite at 1. Okay? Now that I have that information, okay, I've got to find the rest of my curve. Now, what is not there is just as important as what is there when we're looking at this graph. Okay, functions follow their asymptotes. We know that. Okay, and we can't cross vertical ones. So basically I know I'm going to have three pieces. Since I have two vertical asymptotes, I'm going to have three pieces. One on that side, one in between, and one on that side. Okay, so now I got to figure out the behavior of these pieces. Okay, now again, on this left side, or sorry, the right side here, our function's either going to be coming down this asymptote and then following this asymptote out, or it's going to come up this asymptote and follow the horizontal asymptote out. Okay, but again, what's not there is just as important as what is there. So for this function, okay, if it came like this, it would have to cross this x-axis here to get to the horizontal asymptote, because a function is going to follow it. It's going to get really close to this asymptote. It might actually even cross it. We don't know. But what I do know is that I don't have an x-intercept on this side. Since there's no x-intercept, that can't be what's happening in my function. I know for a fact that it's got to come down here and follow my asymptote on this side. Okay, because there's no x-intercept. On the other side, on the right side, I do have this x-intercept right here, which that's telling me that this one comes up this side, crosses over the x-axis, and follows my asymptote that way. How do I know it crosses? Because when I come over here and look at my roots, my root behavior on both of these, my multiplicity is 1, which means at that point, my function will cross the x-axis. If it were 2, power 2, it would bounce, since it was even. But since it's power 1, it crosses. The same thing here for the middle. I know that my function has to go through these 2 points right here. I also know it crosses here. So if I start here and go through this point, it goes down over here, and I can finish this side up over there. And here I can see my finished rational function. And again, make sure that you're looking at it. Make sure that you're only crossing the x-axis at your x-intercepts. Make sure that it passes the vertical line test. And if all those things are true, you've finished your graph. Okay? All right, let's move on to the next one. We're going to follow the same rules. Vertical asymptotes in yellow, horizontal in green, and my intercepts in blue. Okay? So this time I have 3 vertical asymptotes. one at -2, one at -6, one at +3. My horizontal asymptote this time is at 0. I have an x-intercept at 0 and at -4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And that's all I have to draw. Okay, that's all I got. So we have to figure out our behavior. So since this is on the x-axis, it's a little more problematic. So basically I know that my function or my curve is either going to be all above the x-axis or all below. The only way to tell is by plugging in a point and seeing what happens. So I'm going to plug in -10 and I'm going to create a sign chart. So I'm going to plug in my -10 into my factors and find out if those factors become positive or negative. So when I plug in -10, I'm going to get negative, negative on top. On bottom, I'm going to get negative, negative, and negative. Now I don't really care what the number is itself. Okay? What I'm caring about is a sign. So like if I plug -10 in here, I'm going to get -10. So that's a negative number. When I plug -10 in here, I am going to get -6. But the numbers don't matter. It's this negative times that negative, which makes the top positive. And on the bottom, a negative times a negative is positive. So I'm left with a positive divided by a negative, which means here on this side, it's on the negative side. So I'm going to put a point right here on the negative side. I'm actually going to do it in a different color. So that's my negative side, which means that my function has to be on this negative side, and it's going to be all on the negative side because it cannot cross the x-axis because there's no x-intercepts. So I'm going to do the same thing over here on the right side. I'm going to plug in 10 into my factors. I get positive, positive on top, then I get positive, positive, and positive, which means at 10 I'm on the positive side, which is telling me that my curve is on the positive side. Okay? Now, again, these two middle pieces, both of them have an x-intercept. I know that the multiplicity on both of those roots are 1, so they're going to cross. So I'm going to have to do the same thing I just did with a number in between. So you could either pick for this part, you could pick -3, or you could pick -5. It doesn't matter. So I'm going to pick -5. When I plug in -5, I get negative, negative on top, negative, negative, positive on bottom. Those are positive, positive. So at -5, I'm on the positive side, up there. Which means, since my points have to connect and that has to cross, this middle piece is going to look like that. And on the other side, I'm going to pick 1. And when I plug in 1, I'm going to get positive and positive on top, positive, negative, positive on the bottom, which means this is going to be a positive divided by a negative, which is negative, so it's going to be on the negative side here, which means it's going to look very similar to the other piece. Crosses, and it's on the negative side. Okay, so for this one, we had to plug in 4 different points to find out what was going on, where on this one, we only had to do it no times, because this one, and this one all had intercepts to let me know what was going on. Okay, so we had to do a little more work, but it's okay. All right, so the next one. All right, same thing. Start with the information we know: vertical asymptotes, horizontal asymptotes, x and y intercepts. So starting with our vertical ones. We have 3 again. We have one at -3, +3, and +5. Okay. Our horizontal asymptote is at -2, so it's down here. And we have x-intercept at 0 and at -2. Okay? Now, here we go. So let's start with the left side first, this side. Again, our curve's either going to come from the top and go like this, or it's going to come from the bottom and go like this. But no x-intercept here is telling me that I cannot cross the x-intercept, so my function has to come up and then follow my horizontal asymptote out. If it did come from the top, it would have to cross, and since we have no x-intercept there, it can't do that. So we can't have that top piece. Same thing on the right side. It has to come up from the bottom and then follow it out because there's no x-intercept here. Okay? Now, let's talk about this middle piece right here. Okay? Both of these roots are right here. Now, the 0 root is power 2. Its multiplicity is 2, where this one at -2 is 1. So the -2 one crosses, but the other one bounces. So I still don't know what's going to happen, so I got to plug in a point. So I'm going to plug in x equals -1. When I plug in x equals -1, and this is where you got to be careful, -1 squared is +1, and positive times -2 is negative. So the first one on top is negative, and then the second one here is going to be positive. On the bottom, it's positive, negative, negative. Okay? But a negative divided by negative is positive, so this is going to net negative. So at -1, we're on the negative side. Okay? Which means, since this one here bounces, this one's going to come up and hit and bounce and come down. And this side, it's going to come back up and cross through like that. Okay? Because this root at 0 is an even root. It has to bounce off of the x-axis. This one is an odd root, so it has to cross. Okay? And now we got to figure out this piece right here in between. So we're going to plug in a point. 1, 2, 3, 4. So we got to plug in x equals 4. When we plug 4 in on the top, we're going to get negative, positive, and then 4 on the bottom, positive, positive, negative, and negative divided by negative makes this positive, so the whole thing is positive. Okay? So here's the thing. We're on the positive side here. Okay? Which means the whole thing has to be on the positive side. And it's going to look something like this. Because from here, it can't go down and cross the x-axis. If it comes down like this, again, we don't have an x-intercept there, so it can't do that. So it has to come down, and then it's got to turn around and go back, because there's basically no bridge. You can't cross the vertical, can't cross the x-axis, can't cross this vertical. All it can do is U-turn and go back to where it came from. Okay? Yeah, this one's a little trickier because of that, especially with that double root, the multiplicity 2. Okay? All right, last one. So again, start by graphing what we know. Okay? So start with our vertical asymptotes. We have one at -1 and one at 0. So here's our one at 0. Here's our one at -1. Then our horizontal asymptote is at y equals 1/3, right there. Our x-intercepts are at 5, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and -3, 1, 2, 3. Okay? And again, what's there and what's not there. So let's talk about the left and the right side first. Okay? Left and the right side are going to be easy because, again, I have these roots here. They are power 1. So their multiplicity is 1, so my function has to cross. And since it's going to follow the asymptote, okay, and it has to cross right here, the only option is to come up here and then cross and then follow the asymptote. Okay? If it had done this, if it had come down like this and crossed, it would have had to come back and cross the x-axis again, which it cannot do because it's going to come up and try to follow this horizontal asymptote. So it cannot do that second from the top. Same thing on this other side. If it comes down here and crosses, it's going to have to cross back. So it starts down here, crosses my x-axis, and then follows my horizontal asymptote. Now, the only thing left is this middle piece. So again, I have no x-intercept here, so it's either going to be above the x-axis or it's going to be below the x-axis. So we got to plug in a point. But being right here in between 0 and -1, we're going to have to pick -1/2. So plug in -1/2. So when you plug in my first one, you get negative, positive on top. On the bottom, you're going to get negative and positive, because -1/2 plus 1 is +1/2, and that's going to be negative number. So positive, because negative divided by negative is positive, so the whole thing is positive. So we're on the positive side. So we're up here, which again, just like the last one, it's going to come down here, can't cross the x-axis, so it's going to have to U-turn and come back up that way. And that's it. And notice we have no y-intercept because we have a vertical asymptote on the y-axis. And that's graphing rational functions. Just remember, when you're graphing these things, you really have to determine what you see is going on, and you're going to have to think, use some critical thinking skills here. Draw the two examples and examine them and see, okay, can it come down here and cross? Well, no, because it's going to have to cross back to follow the asymptote. So things like that are going to really help you in making sure that you're double checking. Don't just draw a line and be say, okay, that looks good, I'm done. You've really got to think about it, and that's what makes these problems a little more challenging.